Welcome to the Behind the Art Inspiration podcast, a sneak peek into the studio practices of all types of artists, conversations for collectors who love to listen to the banter and creative process of international artists. I'm your host, Caroline Karp. Let's get to it. Well, hello, everyone. This is season number 2 and episode. And in this episode, I'm actually broadcasting historic Georgetown, in the neighborhood of Georgetown, a painting and podcasting studio. And today I'd like to introduce my friend, artist Theresa Elliot. But your name tag.
Theresa Elliot.
Yeah. And I learned about her artwork when I saw a gigantic piece of it in our friend Anthony Aren's house. And there's a story behind that piece. We're going to talk about that. And Theresa, I don't know, she wasn't always artistic. Maybe she was a little bit artistic, but she really became artistic after she had a fall, and it created, she'll talk about that more, but during her recovery is when she really dove into art. So Theresa, let's start by talking about that, and then we'll just, wherever the conversation flows, it flows.
Okay, great. Good morning. It's so nice to be here. Caroline, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a real honor to be on your podcast, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
So where would you like me to begin? Would you like me to talk about the transformation that happened after my concussion?
Yes, because that was in 2018.
Yes, and I have been a photographer since my early 20s, and I had always been creative in that way, but I had never painted or sculpted before. Mm-hmm. And I had an 18-foot fall down a staircase with a very severe concussion. And I was in recovery for about 7 months. And the funny thing was, I actually got up and walked away from the fall. I was very lucky. Mm-hmm. But the pernicious thing about head injuries is that they often don't show up until several days or even a couple of weeks afterwards. It's called post-concussion syndrome. And about a week after my accident, all of a sudden I started seeing spirals in my field of vision. And sometimes they had colors in them, and it was a lot of visual disturbances. And this lasted for a period of several months. And what I ended up doing is I was not allowed to drive. I couldn't go to work. And I was told by the doctors at the concussion clinic I had to do what's called total brain rest, which meant no computers, no TV, no reading. Basically, I was only allowed to go on walks outside, eat, sleep, and that was basically it. So I was starting to slowly go crazy or quickly go crazy. So I decided to get some art supplies together. And in the living room of my townhouse, I just started to put acrylic on canvas and on paper and everything. And within a couple of weeks, I found a YouTube video once I was cleared to watch the computer again about resin art. And so I really just started a period of experimentation. I was out of work for 5 months. And so I just began. And funny, you love sunflowers. And the very first painting that I finished, which was only 3 weeks after my incident, was a painting of a sunflower. And I think I've shared that with you before. I spent
sunflower.
Yeah, sunflower was my very first painting.
You guys can still hear?
Yeah. The reason that
Theresa, we cut out a little bit.
Okay.
Looks like our connection's bad. Here we go. Go ahead. We're back.
Okay. So the very first painting that I completed was a sunflower. And as I know, you are a huge fan of sunflowers as well. And I was seeing what I call mathematical patterns as part of the visual disturbances. I was seeing a lot of fractals and spirals, basically perfect mathematical proportions. And so I decided to really start to make those into things. And so I started painting. And a couple of months later, I moved into actually 3D artwork using resin and gemstones. And I started creating what I call art jewelry.
Right. And so what you're not telling us, because we haven't gotten there yet, is that your resin pieces are phenomenal in the size and the scale and the depth of color and let's talk about the piece that's at Tony's house, because that's pretty incredible.
Yes, it's a 6 foot by 4 foot piece, and it was the first time I had ever attempted to do anything like this. And when you have a head injury, it really provokes a lot of emotions inside of you. If you've ever had a concussion, even a small one, it can create imbalances in the brain, which provoke either anxiety or depression. Some people can get like very up and down with their emotions. And I was experiencing a lot of that, and I needed a project to kind of center me and focus me, because I was really having a lot of problems with my visual disturbances from the concussion, all of the shapes and colors and patterns that I was seeing. And so I went to the Home Depot and I got this giant sheet of what's basically an impermeable backing, so that I could use it. Yeah. So do you need me to start over?
So you went and you picked up supplies, I think is where you were.
Yeah, I went and picked up supplies, and I was walking around with a sketchbook all the time to write down the things that I was seeing. And I talked with a friend of mine, Tony Arend, and he said, well, he was looking for a piece of artwork for his house. And I said, well, I've been, going a little crazy lately with this head injury. Can I take a chance and, maybe try and create something for you? And he was very kind and said yes. And so with no prior experience, I laid down on this 6 foot by 4 foot backing a pattern. I started out with acrylic paints, and I made a geometrically inspired pattern based off of what the visual disturbances I was seeing. And then I started adding recycled glass and pieces of different colored gemstones. And then I started to lay down the resin layers. It was really I guess it took me about 240 hours total. I spent about 4 or 5 weeks working on it. I would get up very early in the morning. And it just sort of evolved while I was working on it. I didn't start out with a set plan. I just had a vision in my mind, and I just kind of worked every day to see where it would go.
So what I want to ask you to do after this, I want you to, because your Instagram feed is full of the beautiful Elizabeth, because she's your most current masterpiece, right?
So. She is my daughter. And I have 2 Instagrams. One is Theresa Amelia Artist, and that is where you're going to find most of my artwork. The one that you and I are connected on is my personal Instagram feed. So I have 2 of them, and I'll be happy to share the other one with you.
Okay, because that's what I was going to ask you to do, is to make sure that that piece that's at Tony's house is at the top. So if people go to check it out, they can kind of see what we're talking about.
Of course.
Now,
sure.
I first saw the piece when I was actually having a show at Tony's house.
Right.
And it was, so we had, believe it or not, we had artwork in the same room.
I know, and what an honor. Your artwork is just so much, I feel so much more advanced than mine. And I was just, so thrilled when you thought I had done a good job.
Oh yeah, it's a gorgeous piece. There's I haven't seen a piece like it before. Like the depth of I guess the gemstones that you have suspended in the resin. Just the depth there, because what are you actually, you're not working on a canvas, are you?
No, because I was using resin, it was really heavy. The whole piece weighs about 45 pounds. And so I had to do some engineering while I was making it. I had to put a lot of forethought into the connections. Like I actually drilled through the backing to put the hanging pieces on before I ever started the artwork. Most of the time, that's the last thing that you'll do. But I knew this resin was going to be a heavy material, and I was adding things like recycled glass and gemstones, and I knew this was going to be a very heavy thing to hang up. So I actually started that first. It was kind of like, okay, here we go. I'm committed now.
Right. And the colors that you use are very pleasing to me, at least in that piece, the blues. And what is the name of that piece?
It's called Andromeda Ocean.
So a lot of ocean inspired.
Mm-hmm.
And then also what you were talking about when you met with me yesterday, you were talking about pendants that are sunflower inspired. So yes. I'm seeing sort of a theme between our two works.
Yes. Part of the feature that I had with my head injury with the visual disturbances, as I mentioned, I was seeing a lot of what are called fractal patterns, spirals. And if you look at the center of a sunflower, nature has inspired it, what the mathematician Fibonacci ended up calling a Fibonacci sequence. So there's a specific mathematical pattern that it follows. And I was actually seeing a lot of those everywhere as a result of my head injury. Yes, and so that was why my first acrylic painting after my head injury was actually of a sunflower, and I spent a lot of time just using a brush kind of as an impressionist sort of technique, and I just spent a lot of time dabbing out those patterns. And I failed a lot, and I kept having to paint over until I got it like sort of right, but you know, it was my first try, so I struggled a little.
Well, that would be an interesting collaboration, actually, because did you find it was easier for you to make the fractals with the gems and the resin?
Yes and no. With the gems and the resin, you have, depending on your technique, you have the ability to move things around while the resin is still warm. Now, that's true on the big piece in Tony's house. But when I'm making my pendants, I'm actually working upside down and backwards. And so that was the other weird and unique thing about what happened with my head injury is that my, I don't want to say like mental processing, but it took a couple of weeks before my world got straightened out again. And so a lot of things, as you're mentally processing, mostly it's linear, but for a couple of weeks in my life, everything was almost upside down and backwards. It's hard to explain unless you've actually had a head injury. And so when I was making those designs, I had to work in slices, and I was working from the bottom up, upside down and backwards.
So you would work from the bottom, and then it would dry, and then you would pour more resin in and do the next layer?
Yes, that's exactly right. The pendants are 3D artwork, so it's hard to tell when you look at them online, except I've taken a couple photos with them at an angle. But if you look at them straight on, they look just like on one plane, but it isn't until you tilt them that you can actually see that the gemstones are actually invisibly suspended in the resin, as it were.
Right. So you're throwing me back to like my high school science lab. Right? When you would take the slices of I don't even know what I'm talking about, but like slices of specimen maybe.
Yeah. It was really kind of a strange inspiration. I had to do a couple of CT scans after my fall, and that was kind of where maybe the CT scans where they do everything by slice as they're looking at parts of your brain. That might have been where I came up with that idea, but I actually don't know. It was a very creative period for me. And, I don't know if I'll ever kind of go through that. I hope I never go through that fall again, but that kind of intense period of creativity that followed my head injury.
Right. So that's very interesting. And before we go, do you want to tell us anything else?
Yeah. One of the things that really kind of stayed with me from that period was learning about empathy for others, because with a concussion, people don't see that you're injured unless you're walking around in a neck brace or some other physical manifestation of the injury that caused the concussion. And in my case, I actually got up and walked away after my fall, miraculously. And so it really just kind of opened my eyes. There's a lot of people walking around that have what we call invisible injuries. I'm also a veteran of the military. I was on active duty for 13 years, and a lot of people that I served with also have these invisible injuries. So that whole experience just taught me more empathy for people, and that is something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. So
Yeah.
thank you for allowing me to share that.
Yeah, and I know that a while back when I first started my podcast, when I started making my video art journals, you had made a comment to me that I should make them with subtitles or with.
Yes.
So maybe we can work together so I can actually make that happen, because I really did research how to do it, but it was mind blowing to me what it would take to make that happen. I think it is important to make information accessible to everyone.
Yeah, right? And art is so subjective. I work in a volunteer capacity with a couple of veteran organizations. One of them is called The Mission Continues, and they have a real emphasis on making all of their volunteer programs and projects accessible for everybody. And the other one is the Armed Services Arts Partnership, and they would do a really tremendous job because a lot of veterans have come back from service with injuries where they've lost eyes or limbs, and so they've adapted. And so finding a way to make your podcasts with those subtitles would be a wonderful way to be more inclusive, and I think that would be wonderful. One thing that I've tried to start thinking about when I'm making my Instagram posts, they do something called alternative texts, and you can actually type out alternative texts for people who use programs that speak to them to describe what is visualized on the page.
Okay, so we'll need to meet together later about this, because then you can teach me how to do that, and then maybe you do a podcast about that to help other artists or people do the same kind of thing.
Well, that would be wonderful, but I'm just so thrilled to have been on your podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time and inviting me here today. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to do my closing statements.
Sure.
So thank you, everybody, for coming and watching and listening as I share my love of fun, connection, collaboration, and art. And it would be great if you were to click the little button and subscribe so you can see more of these each week. And being a facilitator of conversation, what I do each week is I pose an open-ended question to each artist in the true Caroline style, and it says, send me a one-sentence blurb about you and what you do. And from that, the conversation flows. And right now I'm in Georgetown in DC, and as you can see, I have this painting behind me that I'm working on, and it's from a restaurant that's right around the corner. This painting is just in the beginning stages, but it's called, the place is Shea Billy. And I'm sure Theresa's been there.
Yes.
And I was there with my family. And but on the other side of this wall, Michelle Obama was eating. So she might make an appearance in the painting, as well as my family. So that's something I'm working on while I'm here. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Theresa.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
And I'm going to end the broadcast, and I'll tell you when it's over.